Iran's generals are hiding, not from us, from their own military. Right now, while every camera on Earth is pointed at Tehran, a second war is happening that Iran doesn't want you to see. In the mountains of the West, Kurdish fighters have opened 3 fronts in 7 days. IRGC personnel are being killed inside their own cities. Iran's most senior general is appearing in public in a baseball cap, hiding from his own people. The supreme leader hasn't been seen since February, and somewhere above all of it, something is watching every move the IRGC makes. This is the war behind the war, and it might decide what Iran looks like a year from now. If you want clear geopolitical analysis without sensationalism, subscribe and turn on notifications. It is the second week of July 2026, and Tehran is putting on a show. Millions of people, or so the state broadcasts claim, filling the streets with coffins draped in the national flag. Crimson banners of vengeance stretched over intersections. A stage, somewhere in that crowd, where a hardline cleric tells his followers that drones are already tracking the President of the United States, and that a strike from thousands of kilometers away is, in his words, a massive opportunity. It is theater and it's meant to be seen. Every camera crew in the region is pointed at that grief, at that fury, at that performance of strength. But roughly 300 miles to the west, in the folds of the Zagros Mountains, a different war is happening. And this one, Iran is trying very hard to make sure nobody notices. Small teams are moving through the ridgelines at night. They are not IRGC border patrols. They are Kurdish fighters, trained, coordinated, and operating in territory the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has, until very recently, assumed it fully controlled. That assumption is no longer safe. And above them, according to open reporting on the region, satellites and possibly persistent drone coverage are watching, tracking patterns of movement that would have been invisible just a year ago. This is the story of a regime fighting 2 wars at once, one loud and performative in the capital and one quiet and bleeding in the mountains. At the exact moment its command structure looks the most fragile it has looked in years. Let's start with the sequence, because the timing here tells you almost as much as the events themselves. On June 28th, IRGC forces operating out of a regional headquarters launched sustained artillery and mortar fire into the Geshe Highlands, a stretch of high terrain between 2 towns, targeting Kurdish defense fighters dug into positions there. This wasn't a skirmish that ended in minutes. It stretched on for hours. 4 Kurdish fighters, 2 men and 2 women, did not survive the engagement. The IRGC claims it inflicted heavier losses on the other side. Neither figure is independently verifiable from where we sit, and that's worth saying plainly. In an active insurgency, casualty claims from any side should be treated as claims, not confirmed fact. 3 days later, on July 1st, forces from that same headquarters ambushed a vehicle carrying 6 Kurdish Peshmerga fighters near a village in the border region. The night before that ambush, 2 IRGC members were killed outside their own homes, not in some remote outpost, but inside a city. At the same time, a checkpoint on a nearby road was hit, and 3 Iranian security personnel were killed in that single engagement. Then something new happened. A previously unknown Kurdish armed group surfaced in Kermanshah province and claimed its first 2 confirmed strikes against the IRGC. A senior figure in one of the established Kurdish political organizations described what was unfolding in stark terms. This is not a routine border clash. This is an operation, and it was happening across 3 provinces in the same 7-day window. Here's a simple way to picture what a front even means in a place like this. If you've never thought about mountain warfare before, imagine trying to defend a 100-mile stretch of jagged, roadless terrain with only a handful of paved routes running through it. Every convoy you send has to travel one of those few roads. Every checkpoint you build is a fixed, known target. Meanwhile, the people who grew up in those mountains can move across ridgelines that don't appear on any standard map, through cave systems carved out over decades of prior conflict. It is, quite literally, an unfair fight for the side with the tanks. Iran's answer to this was to strike back, hard, but at the wrong target. It launched retaliatory strikes against Kurdish bases across the border in Iraq, hitting them so heavily that a regional gas field supplying power stations in the area was forced to halt operations. Iran, in trying to choke off Kurdish logistics, triggered its own regional electricity shortage. Reporting in the days since suggests Iran has now carried out somewhere in the range of 800 strikes since late February. And yet, in the same window, the insurgency didn't shrink. It opened 3 new fronts. That's a pattern worth sitting with for a second, because it's the kind of thing military historians look back on and call a turning point. When a much larger, better-equipped force keeps hitting the same targets and the resistance keeps growing anyway, that's usually a sign the targets were never really the problem. So who exactly is doing this fighting? It isn't one group, it's a loose coalition of 5, each bringing something different to the table. There are the Eastern Kurdistan Defense Units, widely considered the most battle-hardened element in the coalition, with roots tracing back to decades of guerrilla warfare in this exact terrain, including a significant number of women fighters. Their standard approach is straightforward and brutally effective. Small infiltration teams, often no more than 6 people, moving under cover of darkness, striking a patrol route or a checkpoint, and disappearing back into terrain that's almost impossible to track from the air. There's the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, the oldest and most organizationally mature group in the coalition. What makes them dangerous isn't firepower, it's information. They have people embedded inside Kurdish-majority cities across Iran, feeding back real-time details on troop movements, garrison locations, and patrol schedules. That's a kind of intelligence no drone or satellite can fully replace, because it comes from people who simply live there. There's the Kurdistan Freedom Party, which has been the most consistently offensive of the groups, running planned strike packages against IRGC infrastructure even before this most recent escalation. And now, newly emerged factions are entering the fight as well, a sign that this coalition may be growing rather than shrinking. Here's where the story gets more complicated and more strategically significant. Public reporting from major outlets, including wire services and national newspapers, has described discussions among U.S. and Israeli officials about providing support to Kurdish factions in this region. Statements from American officials earlier in the year expressed hope for a Kurdish victory. None of that amounts to confirmed direct military support, and it would be irresponsible to present it as more certain than it is. But it does raise a genuine and fair question for analysts. What would outside intelligence support for a coalition like this actually look like in practice? The honest answer, based on how modern reconnaissance works, is that it would probably center on surveillance rather than firepower. A single high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft flying at extreme altitude can, in theory, cover an enormous stretch of terrain in one passage, enough to encompass this entire mountainous front in a single sortie, with enough resolution to identify individual vehicles. Add persistent drone coverage loitering over key corridors, and you have something close to full-motion video of enemy movement, feeding directly to encrypted communications terminals on the ground that are small enough to carry in a backpack. If, and this is an assessment rather than a confirmed fact, that kind of picture is reaching Kurdish commanders in something close to real time, it would help explain why ambushes described in recent weeks look less like accidents of terrain and more like planned engagements. A useful historical comparison here. This is the same basic playbook that transformed insurgencies in mountainous terrain elsewhere over the past several decades. Afghanistan, parts of the Balkans, even elements of the original Kurdish resistance in the 1990s. When a lightly equipped force gains reliable eyes in the sky, the balance of a fight in rugged terrain can shift dramatically, even without a single additional rifle changing hands. Kurdish political leadership has described the current period using a specific phrase, a shaping phase, language that, in military circles, usually refers to a period focused on degrading an opponent's command, radar, and logistics networks before a larger push. It's worth noting, carefully, that a number of Iranian radar and early warning installations along this same stretch of the Zagros went dark during an earlier round of strikes this year. Whether that was purely a byproduct of a separate conflict, or whether it also opened a genuine operational window for Kurdish movement, is not something that can be stated as settled fact from where we sit. It is, at minimum, a striking coincidence of timing that deserves attention. There's a kind of poetic symmetry worth pausing on here, even if we shouldn't overstate it. Iran has spent decades supporting armed factions in other countries, in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Iraq, in Yemen. For the first time in a long while, it is now the country dealing with a homegrown, foreign-observed insurgency inside its own borders. That doesn't make what's happening any less serious for the people living through it. It just means the strategic lesson of proxy warfare, that it can eventually be turned back on the state that pioneered it, is playing out in a very literal way. Meanwhile, the human picture at the top of Iran's military looks increasingly strained. The commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Guards made his first public appearance since the earlier conflict began, but not in uniform, not with the usual formal security detail. In a baseball cap, in a crowd, surrounded by plainclothes protection. That is not the posture of a confident commander. It's the posture of someone who understands, better than anyone, how thoroughly his side's command and control was disrupted earlier this year, and who has reason to believe he could be a target himself. Iran's supreme leader, for his part, has not made a confirmed public appearance since February. In any state, a prolonged absence like that from the very top of the hierarchy tends to create uncertainty below it, and uncertainty in a security apparatus already fighting fires on multiple fronts is its own kind of vulnerability. Think about what that means for the ordinary IRGC officer stationed at a checkpoint in Kermanshah province right now. He doesn't know if his convoy schedule has been compromised. He doesn't know if the person watching from the ridge above him has a rifle or a radio. He doesn't know whether his own command structure, several layers up, is functioning normally or quietly reshuffling out of fear. That is an exhausting, corrosive way to hold a position, and it is exactly the kind of pressure an insurgency is designed to create. Now zoom out, because none of this is happening in isolation from Iran's broader strategic position. There is a clock running in the background of all of this, tied to the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, through which a huge share of the world's seaborne oil passes, and one of the most important maritime choke points on the planet. A prior ceasefire arrangement set a 60-day window beginning in mid-June, with an expiration in mid-August. Iran's ambassador told a forum in Beijing this past weekend that transit fees will be charged once that window closes. Iran and Oman have reportedly presented a joint proposal for collecting such fees to Washington. It was rejected immediately, with American officials stating flatly that no country is permitted to charge fees on an international waterway, and the American position remains that the strait should stay free of charge permanently. Formal negotiations on this dispute aren't scheduled to begin until after this week's mourning period concludes. Meanwhile, tanker traffic through the strait is recovering, though not yet back to pre-conflict levels. Reports over the last day put transit numbers at roughly 40 ships, moving back up toward the flow the strait was carrying before the earlier conflict disrupted it. Every one of those ships represents a captain making a calculated risk assessment before entering those waters, a shipping company weighing insurance costs against delivery schedules, and ultimately, further down the chain, a driver filling up a truck or a family checking a fuel price on a screen without ever knowing the name of the strait that made that price what it is. So here is the genuinely difficult question sitting underneath all of this, and it's one worth thinking through rather than skipping past. Iran is currently fighting an internal insurgency across 3 provinces, dealing with a visibly rattled senior command structure, and has not resolved the fundamental dispute over Hormuz transit fees that could reignite tension within weeks. Does a regime in that position have the bandwidth to escalate further? Or does internal pressure make de-escalation more likely simply because the alternative is unsustainable? There's no settled answer to that. Analysts disagree, and reasonable people looking at the same facts can land in different places. That uncertainty is, in itself, the story. Before we close out, a quick global detour, because there's a development elsewhere that deserves attention and isn't getting nearly enough of it. On July 3rd, North Korea's leader stood on the deck of a newly commissioned 5,000-ton destroyer and watched it test-fire a nuclear-capable strategic cruise missile, unarmed for the test, but described as capable of carrying a warhead. The ship reportedly carries around 74 vertical launch cells, meaning it can carry a mix of cruise missiles, anti-ship weapons, surface-to-air interceptors, and short-range ballistic missiles in the same hull. For context, that kind of multi-role vertical launch capability is the same basic design philosophy behind some of the most capable surface combatants operated by major navies today. A ship like this represents a meaningful jump in North Korea's ability to project force at sea. not just along its own coastline. It's a story that, on any other week, would be leading headlines on its own. Right now, it's happening quietly in the shadow of everything unfolding in Iran. So where does all of this leave us? Iran heads into the coming weeks managing an insurgency it cannot seem to suppress through force alone, a command structure that is visibly cautious about its own exposure, and a maritime dispute with a hard deadline in mid-August that has already been rejected by Washington once. Kurdish factions appear to be in a deliberate shaping phase rather than a final push, which suggests the more significant developments may still be ahead rather than behind us. And elsewhere in the world, a separate and serious naval development is unfolding largely without scrutiny. None of this points to a single, certain outcome. It points to a set of pressures converging on the same government at the same time, with a real deadline approaching and a regime that looks less unified than it has in years. Over the next several weeks, watch three things closely: whether Kurdish operations shift from ambush-style engagements towards something more sustained, whether Iran's senior leadership begins appearing in public in a more normal, confident posture, or continues the pattern of visible caution we're seeing now, and what actually happens as the Hormuz fee dispute approaches its deadline in mid-August. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a government can't fully secure its own mountains, can't confirm its own supreme leader has been seen in public in months, and is still negotiating over a waterway it doesn't fully control the terms of, how much longer can it manage all of that at once before something has to give? Let us know what you think happens over the next few weeks, and we'll be tracking every part of this story as it develops.